Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Amanda. It's been great listening to the talks before me. Amelia was quite fascinating. Jennifer was equally fascinating. But let me go back to Milo, because he started talking about what you can say and what you can't say in certain academic conferences and certain settings. And I want to sort of move the territory a little bit and talk about speech in terms of a country and what you can say, what you can't say, what's permitted, what's not permitted. I essentially want to tell the story of free speech in America. I want to tell the story of the First Amendment, which is a story that we pretty much, most Americans anyway, think we know. The same way that we know about, there was this Declaration of Independence, and it guaranteed us life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then there was the Constitution, and it guaranteed us free speech. What else is there to know? We've had free speech pretty much forever since the founding. And what that means to most people is that, well, we have this precious right in America, which means we can pretty much say what we want. And if you look at any poll that comes out, you have upwards of 90% of Americans that fully support, the right to free speech and the right to also to a free press. So you would think we have had a clear understanding of this from the beginning, that we know exactly what it is, that we're all in agreement about it, and that it's a great, great thing. And I would say, well, not so fast. First of all, it's worth considering that the First Amendment, like the rest of the Bill of Rights, was not included in the Constitution originally. It was not considered something that was necessary. And part of why it wasn't considered something necessary was that the concern of the framers at the time was, how do that we don't really need to protect ourselves against this country that we are forming, against the leaders of this country that we are forming. Because the Bill of Rights, if you think about it, is really a set of freedoms that we have from our government. And the framers were thinking, well, why do we need that? Cooler heads prevailed, I guess, and Madison convinced them that we needed a Bill of Rights. And we got one. It was ratified 2 years after the Constitution itself in 1791. And then the First Amendment, of course, guaranteed freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assembly, freedom to petition the government. And so, boom, we've had it pretty much from the beginning, at least from 1791. But then we got into a tussle with France. And in 1798, we decided as a country, or at least the Congress decided, that we needed to pass Alien and Sedition Acts, to keep down dissent in this country, with particularly dissent that might be aligned with foreign interests. So all of a sudden, it was illegal to speak out against the government. It was illegal to speak out against Federalists, which controlled the government at that time. So you had several editors who were put in jail. You had politicians and political activists who were also in prison for the crime of criticizing their government. So much for free speech. It was a right that was sort of there, that we never really took seriously, and that almost immediately, which is to say a few years after we ratified it, we got rid of with the Alien and Sedition Acts. When Jefferson came in, he pretty much got rid of the Alien and Sedition Acts, but we never really came to any appreciation for free speech. And so you go through all of the 19th century where we just didn't think that was a right worth protecting. And part of why we didn't think it was a right worth protecting was because at that point, the First Amendment didn't apply to states. And so if you were against slavery, for instance, and you wanted to print anti-slavery pamphlets in the South, forget about it. It was illegal. You could be arrested. You could be tarred and feathered, essentially. If you wanted to have a newspaper that spoke out against that, your newspaper could be destroyed. Free speech was something that was this nice bauble that we had in the Constitution, but it really didn't mean much of anything at all. And that was true all the way through the 20th until the 20th century. And then you get to the 20th century, and what happens then? Well, we have a war. We have World War I in 1917. We get involved in World War I. And the United States decides, oh my God, we have a war. We can't have people saying things against the country during the war. We have to prevent that. So again, you have the Espionage Act that's passed in what 1917. You have a Sedition Act again passed the following year, which was an amendment to that, which basically made it illegal to criticize the U.S. government, at least in terms of the war, and it was construed very broadly. You had the entire leadership of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, hauled into a federal court in Chicago. It was the largest trial probably that we've ever had in this country. We had over 100 people tried at one time in a federal courtroom. And what was their crime? Their crime was basically speaking out against the war. And that leadership was all convicted. You had political speakers who were tossed into jail. You had immigrants of all sorts who were tossed into jail. And in the midst of this, and you had the Palmer riots and roundups, where you had the federal government basically rounding up immigrants who were considered a threat because something they had said, or some institution they belonged to, or some group they belonged to, had been critical of the government, and that just could not be permitted. So you have over a century of this First Amendment that really didn't mean anything as in practical terms, because it didn't protect us against what it was supposed to protect us against, which was the government saying you can't speak about certain things. And that didn't really begin to change until after World War I. And you had a series of things that happened after World War I. We had all this repression that stemmed directly from people criticizing the war, and laws that were passed to make it illegal to do such a thing. And you had a number of cases that began to test that in court, and you also had the evolution of a civil liberties movement. The biggest sort of player in that, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, was formed in 1920, in sort of the shadow of the Palmer raids, which took place largely in 1919. And so all of a sudden there's this consciousness about, wait a minute, we do have this thing called the First Amendment. Maybe it should mean something. And they began, along with other groups, to try to make it mean something. So you had a series of challenges to how the law had been interpreted to that time. And probably the most important one, or well, not the most important one, but the one that sort of started all off was 1919, Abrams versus United States, which basically began because you had a bunch of Russian immigrants who were throwing pamphlets out of a window, complaining about the U.S. intervention in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, and about anti-Bolshevik activities by America. That struck authorities as sedition, because it's critical of the government, right? And it has something to do with conflict. And so you had these Russian immigrants hauled into jail, hauled into court, and sentenced and convicted of sedition. Actually, they were convicted of some more specific act, but they were sentenced to sentences varying between 10 and 20 years. And that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It went to the Supreme Court, arrived in the Supreme Court in 1919, and the decision came down. It was a 7-2 decision, basically saying they belonged in prison. They had no right to throw pamphlets out their window. But there was a dissent. There were two dissenters, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Louis Brandeis, who said, wait a minute. We do have a First Amendment here, right? And what these guys were doing was not really all that serious. They weren't really an imminent danger to the country. What are we doing here? But they lost that argument. And then you had in 1925 another case. It was called Gitlow v. New York, and that was all about some printers who had basically published within their newspaper a a manifesto criticizing the United States. And these guys were also hauled into prison. They were charged with violating a New York law, what was called a Syndicalism Act. They were hauled into court. They were convicted, and their case goes up to the Supreme Court. And again, the Supreme Court upholds their convictions, but something interesting happened along the way. The Supreme Court also decided, wait a minute, this is a New York state law. This is not a federal law. And they had to make a decision about whether or not the First Amendment applied to the states. So for the first time in 1925, they decided, wait a minute, the First Amendment does apply to the states. And they used the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to make that argument. And they said, okay, so they should be able to have their speech protected. But be that as it may, they were still saying some pretty dangerous stuff. So we got to send them to prison. And they, again, that conviction stood. You go to 1927, you had a woman named Charlotte Whitney, who was a socialite from California. And she had made the big mistake of becoming a socialist and then a communist, which immediately put her in violation of the California law, which didn't allow you to become a communist, because communists were for the overthrow of the government, right? And that was not protected speech. So even though she had done nothing as an individual that was threatening to the United States, she was hauled into prison. She was convicted, and the case goes to the Supreme Court. Again, the Supreme Court upholds it. But the duel of Brandeis and Holmes say, wait a minute. When the founders articulated this idea of free speech, they must have meant what they said. And they must have meant that we can have free and robust discussion in this country. They weren't afraid of that. Why are we afraid of it? And gradually, slowly, across the decades, that idea began to take root, and more, the court began to look with favor upon arguments which basically said Americans should have the right to speech. And we go all the way to 1969, and there was a case called Brandenburg of the Ohio, and this was a case that centered on the KKK. In the city in Ohio, which had decided to have a rally, basically a hate rally, where they denounced Jews and they denounced blacks and they said all kinds of hateful things, but they didn't do anything violent, at least not at the moment. And the Supreme Court said, wait a minute, these guys have a right to free speech. They can say what they feel, what they want to say. And that was sort of a revolutionary decision. And it was a culmination of a lot of stuff that had happened over the last 40 years that took us on this journey that began in 1791 with the ratification of the Bill of Rights, where America finally recognized, in modern terms, what we consider to be the First Amendment. And I will, sort of, I want to make one other point before I end it here. And it's interesting. I mean, we're now re-engaging that argument again. We have a president who's been impeached, who will be tried by the Senate in a couple of weeks. For what? For hateful speech, for incitement to insurrection. And even though it's not a criminal trial, it's an impeachment. You had the head of Penn, who wrote an article, I think a day or two ago, with the New York Times, who was concerned that this may become a vehicle to infringe on free speech. So you have this interesting thing that's happened, and that's happened at other points as well. But when you have people who are perpetrators of hate speech, people who are perpetrators of anti-immigrant, anti-minority, anti-democratic violence, who are saying, we have free speech protections. Please don't violate our protections. We have the right and the obligation to say what we're saying. And it's an interesting debate. It's one that's far from over as we begin to consider what kind of speech can be allowed in America, and what kind of speech is protected in America, and who has a responsibility to protect it, and how is it best protected, and how do you weigh that right against other rights? Because what we have very clearly sort of established in custom and law is that whatever free speech means, it doesn't mean the right to say whatever you want, whenever you want about anybody. And I think I'll just end it there.